In June 1992, the quiet southwest side of Houston, Texas, became the scene of one of the most shocking mass murders the city had ever witnessed. Inside a modest home on Brownstone Lane, 6 people, family, friends, neighbors, were simply spending an ordinary evening together. They had no idea that within minutes, their lives would collide with a ruthless crime that would leave 4 of them dead, 2 fighting for their lives, and the entire state asking how something so brutal could happen. Authorities say the attackers were 3 men tied to the interstate drug trade. One of them was Arthur Brown Jr., a 21-year-old known by the street name Squirt. Brown had grown up struggling in school, drifting into the world of drugs and fast cash. By 1992, prosecutors say he wasn't just involved in the drug game. He was armed, dangerous, and ready to take what he wanted. What happened inside that house was pure terror. The victims were bound with torn bed sheets, forced to the floor, and shot execution style. Jose Tovar, Audrey Brown, 17-year-old Frank Farias, and 19-year-old Jessica Quinones, who was 7 months pregnant, never made it out alive. 2 others, Jose's wife Rachel Tovar and family friend Nicholas Cortez, were left for dead. But they survived, and their eyewitness accounts would point directly to Arthur Brown Jr. as one of the shooters. The brutality of the killings, the age of the victims, and the sheer coldness of the attack sent shockwaves through Texas. And from the moment Brown was arrested in Alabama after fleeing the state, the case would unravel into decades of courtroom battles, claims of innocence, accusations of withheld evidence, and debates about intellectual disability and racial bias in the justice system. Yet through it all, Arthur Brown Jr. maintained one thing: that he was not the killer. 30 years later, inside the Huntsville death chamber, that claim would become his final message to the world. On March 9, 2023, as witnesses watched from behind the glass, Brown declined the special last meal Texas once allowed death row inmates. And when the warden asked if he had any final words, Brown used his last breaths to accuse the state of executing an innocent man. He said, "What is occurring here tonight is not justice. It's murder of an innocent man. I asked for DNA. I was denied DNA. Tonight, Texas will kill a second innocent man." Minutes later, at 6:37 p.m., he was pronounced dead. To understand how a drug-related robbery turned into one of Houston's most haunting mass murders, how 2 survivors identified their attackers from their hospital beds, and how a man with a childhood IQ score of 70 spent decades fighting a system he said was determined to kill him, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap that notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just raise questions about crime. It raises questions about justice itself. To understand how the Brownstone Lane murders unfolded, we have to begin long before the bullets and bloodshed. Back in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Arthur Brown Jr. grew up in a world that seemed to stack the odds against him from the very beginning. Born into a low-income neighborhood where poverty shaped nearly every aspect of daily life, Brown spent his early years navigating instability, limited educational resources, and a constant sense of being overlooked. Teachers described him as quiet, withdrawn, and often confused in class. Academic records later revealed something more significant: an IQ score of 70 when he was in elementary school, a number that would follow him for the rest of his life and become the centerpiece of future appeals claiming intellectual disability. But in the 1970s and 80s, in Brown's community, those numbers didn't lead to specialized care or long-term intervention. Instead, they were quietly filed away as he fell further behind. By the time he reached adulthood, Brown was drifting. With few job opportunities and even fewer positive role models, he gravitated toward the fast-moving, high-risk world of street hustling and drug deals that offered quick money and an escape from the financial pressures at home. In his early 20s, Brown developed close ties with 2 other young men, Marion Dudley and Antonio Dunson, individuals prosecutors would later call his partners in crime. Together, the trio became associated with a small but active drug distribution network that moved between Alabama, Texas, and other parts of the South, dealing cocaine, cash, and weapons. What began as small transactions eventually led to bigger risks, bigger profits, and bigger enemies. And by 1992, prosecutors say they were deeply entangled in a drug world where loyalty was temporary and violence was never far away. But Arthur Brown's story was only one side of the tragedy that was about to unfold. The other side belonged to the people living on Brownstone Lane, a modest home in southwest Houston where an ordinary day would soon turn into one of the city's most horrific crime scenes. At the center of the home was Jose Guadalupe Tovar, a husband, father, and longtime resident of the neighborhood. Though he held a reputation for selling drugs out of his house, those who knew him described him as someone who always kept his family close and welcomed relatives and friends into his home. His wife, Rachel Tovar, was known for her warm personality and her loyalty to the people she loved, qualities that would later fuel her fight to survive the unimaginable. On the day of the murder, the Tovar home was busy with the people they cared about most. Frank Farias, just 17 years old, was spending time with family. He was a typical teenager, energetic, curious, still figuring out his place in the world. Jessica Quinones, only 19 and 7 months pregnant, was visiting her boyfriend's relatives. She was expecting her first child, excited for the future, and completely unaware that her life, and the life she carried, would be caught in a violent crossfire. Neighbor Audrey Brown stopped by the house in what should have been a brief, harmless visit. She lived close by, knew the family well, and never imagined that simply walking into their home would seal her fate. Also present was Nicholas Cortez, a family friend who had no connection to the drug trade, but enjoyed spending time with the Tovars. His presence that night was an accident of timing, one that would cost him almost everything. For the Tovars and their guests, June 20th, 1992 began as a perfectly normal summer evening. People talked, ate, laughed, and drifted through the house in the casual way families do. No one expected danger. No one sensed the violence approaching their door. It was a night that should have ended with everyone going home, turning off lights, and settling into bed. Instead, before the clock reached nightfall, their home would be invaded, their lives shattered, and their names forever tied to one of the most disturbing mass murders in Houston's history. June 20th, 1992. Brownstone Lane, a quiet Houston neighborhood where nothing seemed out of place. But just after 8 o'clock that night, the stillness was shattered. According to investigators, 2 armed men forced their way into the home of 37-year-old Jose Tovar, a man known in the community for running a small-scale drug operation out of his residence. What happened next would become one of the most brutal mass killings in the city's recent history. Inside the house were 7 people: Jose, his wife Rachel, friends Frank Farias and Audrey Brown, 19-year-old Jessica Quinones, who was 7 months pregnant, and others who had come to visit. None of them had any warning. The intruders immediately demanded drugs and money, shouting orders as they moved from room to room. Witnesses and surviving victims later described how everyone was tied with bedsheets, hands bound behind their backs, ankles secured, forced to lie face down on the floor. The attackers showed no hesitation, no fear, no signs of mercy. This was an execution scene in the making. Moments later, the house erupted in gunfire. Jose Tovar was shot execution style, a close-range blast that ended his life instantly. Frank Farias, lying helpless beside him, was also gunned down where he lay. 19-year-old Jessica Quinones, still carrying her unborn child, was shot in the head, both mother and baby dying at the scene. Audrey Brown, another visitor in the home, was killed as the gunman swept through the room, firing at anyone who moved or breathed. But somehow, in that storm of bullets and chaos, 2 people survived. Rachel Tovar, Jose's wife, was shot in the face, the bullet ripping through her cheek. With extraordinary presence of mind, she remained completely still, pretending to be dead until the attackers left. Another victim, Nicholas Cortez, survived multiple gunshot wounds, bleeding, barely conscious but alive. When the gunmen finally fled the scene, taking cash, drugs, and whatever else they could find, the house fell into a chilling silence. A silence filled only by the sound of 2 survivors struggling to breathe. And it would be Rachel Tovar and Nicholas Cortez, still shaking, covered in blood, their lives forever changed, who later identified one of the attackers as Arthur Brown Jr., a man they claimed they saw inside the home that night, participating in the robbery, the assault, and the execution-style killings that took 4 lives and left 2 others shattered. The Houston Police Department arrived at the Brownstone Lane residence within minutes of a frantic 911 call, but nothing could prepare them for what was waiting behind that front door. Officers stepped into what detectives would later describe as a massacre. The air was thick with gunpowder. Bodies were scattered across the living room floor. Every victim was bound with torn bedsheets, their hands tied behind their backs, ankles secured, faces pressed to the ground in the moments before the shooting. Pools of blood soaked deep into the carpet, running beneath furniture and across the tile. The scene was so violent, so deliberate, that seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. Detectives began methodically collecting evidence. Spent shell casings, all from the same caliber weapon, bedsheet bindings, torn and knotted by hand, and multiple drug packaging materials, confirming that the Tovar home had been used for small-scale cocaine distribution. It was clear this wasn't a random attack. This was a targeted hit. But the most critical break in the case didn't come from the crime scene. It came from the survivors. At Ben Taub Hospital, Rachel Tovar regained consciousness, her face bandaged from the gunshot wound that nearly killed her. Despite unimaginable pain and trauma, she immediately told detectives she recognized one of the attackers. When presented with a photographic lineup, she pointed straight to Arthur Brown Jr., identifying him as one of the armed intruders who tied them up and opened fire. Around the same time, Nicholas Cortez, still recovering from multiple gunshot wounds, also identified Brown as one of the men inside the house that night. Their independent statements, given separately under medical supervision, became the foundation of the prosecution's case. The emerging motive was consistent and chilling. Authorities believed the attack was a drug robbery gone bad. Investigators determined that Brown and his associates had allegedly come to steal cocaine and cash from Tovar's operation. When the robbery spiraled out of control, the robbers executed nearly everyone in the house. More than $8,000 in cash and a significant quantity of cocaine were reported missing after the attack. The investigation quickly expanded beyond Texas. Detectives tracked Brown's movements across state lines and began coordinating with federal agencies. Within days, Arthur Brown Jr. was located and arrested in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, after fleeing Houston. His co-defendants, Marion Dudley and Antonio Dunson, were also apprehended in separate operations, bringing all suspected participants into custody. For investigators, the picture was becoming clear. This was a calculated robbery, a planned attack, and one of the most brutal crimes Houston had seen in decades. And according to the surviving victims, Arthur Brown Jr. was at the center of it. When the case of Arthur Brown Jr. finally reached the Harris County courtroom, nearly a year after the massacre on Brownstone Lane, prosecutors made it clear from day one. They believed Brown was not just present that night. He was one of the gunmen who carried out the cold-blooded executions. The prosecution opened with its strongest evidence, the eyewitness identifications from the 2 surviving victims, Rachel Tovar and Nicholas Cortez. Both had been shot. Both had nearly died. And both, the state argued, had no reason to lie. They each pointed to Brown as one of the men who tied them with bedsheets and fired the shots that killed 4 people, including a pregnant teenager. Prosecutors also highlighted the drug relationship between Brown, his co-defendants, and the Tovar household. They showed the jury phone records, witness statements, and investigative notes documenting the extensive cocaine dealings that connected all parties. According to the state, this was not a crime of passion. It was a targeted drug robbery planned and executed by people who knew exactly what they were after. Crime scene analysts presented ballistics and forensic evidence, including shell casings and the trajectory analysis that demonstrated the victims were shot at close range while lying face down. Police officers and detectives testified about the brutality of the scene, the missing cash, and the chaotic escape that followed. The testimony of the surviving victims, still bearing scars from that night, became the emotional anchor of the prosecution's case, with Rachel Tovar recounting the moment she pretended to be dead as her attackers fled. But the defense pushed back hard. Brown's attorneys argued that he wasn't even in Texas on the night of the murders, attempting to establish an alibi that placed him elsewhere during the attack. They emphasized that no fingerprints, no DNA, and no physical evidence directly tied him to the Brownstone Lane residence. The bedsheets bore no trace of him. The shell casings could not be matched to a weapon associated with him, and no witness outside the victims placed him at the scene. The defense centered its argument on the fallibility of eyewitness identification, especially under extreme duress. They told the jury that Rachel Tovar and Nicholas Cortez were shot, terrified, and disoriented, struggling to survive, conditions that they claimed made reliable recognition nearly impossible. But after weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and final arguments that emphasized either cold-blooded guilt or catastrophic misidentification, the jury retired to deliberate. It didn't take long. When the jurors returned, the courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Guilty of capital murder for the deaths of Jose Tovar, Frank Farias, Jessica Quinones, and Audrey Brown. With that verdict came the ultimate sentence permitted under Texas law. Arthur Brown Jr. was sentenced to death, joining his co-defendants on death row for one of the most devastating mass murders in Houston's history. After his conviction, Arthur Brown Jr. began what would become a 3-decade battle through the American appeals system, a fight not just for his life, but for what he insisted was the truth. Throughout the 30 years that followed, Brown and his attorneys argued that the state of Texas had sentenced the wrong man. In every appeal, every motion, and every handwritten letter from his death row cell, Brown maintained the same claim. He was innocent, and he had been framed by witnesses who misidentified him under extreme trauma and by investigators who, he alleged, focused on him without properly examining others involved in the drug trade. His attorneys pointed to intellectual disability as a crucial issue that the courts allegedly overlooked. Childhood records showed Brown's IQ hovering around 70, a score that placed him within the range of significant cognitive impairment. They argued that under Supreme Court precedent, executing someone with an intellectual disability violated the Eighth Amendment. The state countered with later evaluations showing higher scores, claiming Brown did not meet the legal definition of disability. The appeals grew more complex when defense attorneys accused prosecutors of withholding ballistics evidence, alleging that certain reports about the crime scene had never been turned over to the defense at trial. They argued that this information could have supported the theory that more than one gunman was present and that Brown was not the shooter the state claimed him to be. One of the most contested issues came when Brown sought DNA testing on the bedsheets used to tie the victims and other items collected from the scene. Despite repeated filings, courts rejected the request, adopting the state's position that testing the bindings, decades later, would not be able to prove who tied the victims and would not meaningfully change the outcome of the trial. Brown's attorneys also raised concerns of racial bias, pointing to sworn statements that alleged at least one juror expressed racist attitudes during deliberations. The defense argued that such bias violated Brown's constitutional right to an impartial jury, but the courts ruled that the claims were unsubstantiated and procedurally barred. For every claim raised by the defense, the state of Texas pushed back with equal force. Prosecutors insisted that the evidence against Brown remained strong. 2 surviving victims identified him. His ties to the drug network were undeniable, and the robbery motive was supported by missing cash and cocaine. They argued that the appeals relied on technicalities, speculation, and theories that did not alter the overwhelming weight of the original testimony. And so, year after year, motion after motion, the answer from the courts stayed the same. By the time Brown's final appeal reached the U.S. Supreme Court, he had spent over 30 years on death row. And for the last time, the courts declined to intervene. Every appeal was officially denied. The execution date was set. On March 9, 2023, after more than 3 decades of appeals, filings, and failed last-minute petitions, the long and painful journey of the Brownstone Lane massacre reached its final chapter inside the walls of the Huntsville Unit in Texas, home to the state's death chamber. As the sun set over Huntsville, corrections officers began the quiet, methodical preparations that signaled the end was near. At approximately 4 p.m., Arthur Brown Jr. was transferred from his holding cell to the execution chamber, a sterile room he had spent decades trying to avoid. Strapped to the gurney, he lay motionless as medical staff inserted 2 intravenous lines, one in each arm, double-checking the tubing that would deliver the lethal dose. On the other side of the glass, separated by thick panes and 2 decades of trauma, family members of the victims took their seats. Some sat silently. Some prayed. Others clenched tissues, bracing for the moment they had waited for since 1992. As required by protocol, officials offered Brown a final meal. According to Texas Department of Criminal Justice records, he declined a special request, as Texas had ended the tradition years earlier. Instead, he was served the standard institutional dinner: cornbread, mashed potatoes, mixed vegetables, and a standard entree, but Brown refused it, leaving the tray untouched. Then came the final words, the last chance for a man to speak before the state ended his life. Reading calmly from a prepared statement, Arthur Brown Jr. delivered one of the most forceful final declarations of innocence ever recorded inside the Texas death chamber. According to the official transcript, he said, "What is occurring here tonight is not justice. It's murder of an innocent man. I asked for DNA. I was denied DNA. If I'm innocent, he was innocent. Tonight, Texas will kill a second innocent man." He continued insisting that he had been wrongly convicted, addressing the witnesses, the state officials, and the family members of those lost that night on Brownstone Lane. At 6:18 p.m., the warden signaled for the execution to begin. The lethal injection, a combination of drugs designed to stop the heart, began flowing through the 4 lines. Brown closed his eyes, taking his final breaths as the room fell silent. 19 minutes later, after decades of legal battles, controversies, and claims of innocence, Arthur Brown Jr. was pronounced dead at 6:37 p.m. Outside the prison walls, protesters lowered their signs. Reporters filed their stories. And inside, the chamber lights dimmed as another chapter in Texas death penalty history came to a close. 4 people lost their lives in a crime so brutal, so senseless, that it carved itself into Houston's history and left families shattered in ways words can barely describe. Yet even now, more than 30 years later, the case of Arthur Brown Jr. remains a storm of unresolved questions and painful contradictions. Did Texas truly execute a man responsible for one of the most cold-blooded massacres the city has ever seen? Or did a system, strained by human error, fractured by bias, and resistant to new evidence, carry out the ultimate punishment against someone who never received a full chance to prove his innocence? In a justice system where finality can come faster than clarity, this case forces us to confront a difficult truth. Sometimes the answers die with a man strapped to the gurney. So now we turn to you. What do you believe? Share your thoughts, your theories, and your reactions in the comments below. Hit like, share this documentary with others who care about real justice, and make sure you subscribe to Crime Report Network so you never miss another in-depth, real-life true crime story that asks the questions most are afraid to face.